Hey everyone, Warwick's here. Yep, it's a classic voiceover video with a dungeon run to occupy your time. Enjoy this plus 13 Spires of Ascension while listening to my rant on the Monk class. So there's been a lot of news coming out of the 9.1 PTR. Between the raid, Korthia, all the changes to the Maw, and Torghast, there's been something new, it feels like, every couple of days coming out on PTR. One thing that hasn't seen as frequent is class changes. While there's been some class changes, a lot of classes haven't seen any at all. One class that hasn't received any meaningful PvE changes is Monk. In this video, I want to go over the things that I think need to be done with each Monk spec. I'll give a current state to the best of my knowledge, a Cloud 9 type wishlist item that is probably too much for the scope of a patch, and one or two smaller changes that I think are capable to be done in the scope of a single patch. Before we get into the Monk wishlist, as always guys, hit the subscribe button below this video. It truly does help give me support for what I want to achieve, and for a creator like myself who is trying to grow, seeing a new subscriber is one of the best parts of my day. So thank you all to those that have subbed so far, I appreciate it greatly. I'm thankful every day that I have you guys sub to my channel. You can also check out my stream. I stream on Twitch and YouTube simultaneously now, so you can catch me on both platforms. That is Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday night from 9:30 p.m. to midnight Central Standard Time. So check me out on either platform if you're choosing, whether you follow the YouTube channel or you follow my Twitch channel. I'd love to be able to grow both of those. Enough of the self plugs. Let's get into the Monk specs, and we're going to start with my main spec, Brewmaster Monk. So what is the Brewmaster Monk current state? So Brewmaster Monk is not the dominant raid tank that it was in BFA. It fell to the middle of the pack performance-wise, but it is still the second most popular tank if you look at Warcraft logs in terms of number of Mythic raid logs that have been done. And it's probably the middle of the pack representation-wise in Mythic Plus. Brewmaster fell in terms of tankiness after both Purifying and Celestial Brew got a cooldown increase during beta, and it really didn't get anything else to sort of compensate for that nerf. It really hurt Brewmaster Monk, I think, a lot more than people realized, and kind of made it kind of a middle of the road tank. And that sort of tankiness that it had in Battle for Azeroth just hasn't been achieved since. Now, Brewmaster scales very well with agility, so I'm confident the tank will be roaming back into the mix as a top tank in the raid, and Mythic Plus as well, now that Season 2 is starting to become closer and closer with each passing day. Overall, the outlook is looking positive, but in its current state, it does a lot of damage. It's the second or third most damaging tank behind Guardian and behind Prot Paladin. So it does a lot of good damage, especially in single target with both Stormstout's Last Keg and Memory of Charred Passions legendaries. But from a tankiness perspective, it's kind of middle of the road behind Guardian Druid, Blood DK, and even possibly Vengeance Demon Hunter. So what is a change outside of the scope of a patch that I want to see? It really was easy for me to make this decision, and that's overhaul the talent tree. Outside of the second row with mobility, with Celerity, Chi Torpedo, and Tiger's Lust, the talent choices I've made on my Brewmaster Monk haven't changed since I leveled the character to level 100 when I made this character about 2.5 years ago or so now. The talent tree for Brewmaster is so incredibly one note that I do not think about what talents to play in Mythic Plus versus Raid like I would on a DPS spec or even my healer specs. This makes the spec incredibly reliant on the base gameplay in order to retain players. If the base gameplay is interesting, players stick around. If the base gameplay is not all that interesting, players flee the spec pretty hard. I've seen a lot of players ditch the spec because it's not considered all that fun, it's considered very straightforward, and one of the easiest tanks to learn. And to couple with that, there's no way to freshen up your gameplay through talent choices. So you're stuck playing the same style and the same build pretty much the entire time that you are playing Brewmaster Monk. There's no way to fix that at all. So what are the changes inside the scope of a patch that I'd like to see? Well, the first one is make Purifying Brew a base 12-second cooldown again. This enables bigger Celestial Brews, which you use on cooldown anyways. which allows your absorb shields to be a lot bigger on a much more consistent basis, because Celestial Brew shield is based on the amount of damage you've recently recently purified. And I think that this is a way to increase the tankiness of Brewmaster in a way that isn't necessarily 100% intuitive to maybe brand new players, but is quite powerful in the long run. I think the 14-second base duration is a little bit too long, and I'd like to see that duration be reduced that additional 2 seconds back down to 12, so that Celestial Brew on average is going to be around probably 9 seconds or so between talents and the little bit of haste scaling that it has. I think this would be a great way to make a small change to Brewmaster Monk that doesn't involve changing stagger at all, which is always very, very dicey to do, because stagger with small tweaks can become infinitely powerful, or it becomes very, very weak, and so you have to be very careful playing with it. I think this is a way to get around that. The second change would be adding another defensive cooldown. While Brewmaster has Fortifying Brew, it's really the only defensive that it has. Okay, technically Zen Meditation is a defensive ability, but Zen Meditation has a ton of drawbacks to it. Currently, the ability is a channeled ability that basically plants you in the spot. If you move, take an action, or your enemy really hits you, it cancels the Zen Meditation channel. While it's a big damage reduction at I think 50%, it's basically useless because of all those drawbacks. I'd like to see Zen Meditation turned into an active ability with a 6 to 8 second duration that grants maybe like a 15 to 20% flat damage reduction. I think it really plays into the Brewmaster power fantasy, where it's very smooth damage intake with these real bursty windows. With a short duration and maybe like a 2-minute cooldown, it's not something that is going to be up consistently, so I don't think it's overpowered in that case, but it is something that just makes the Brewmaster Monk slightly more tanky with a damage reduction for maybe big damage events, or if it needs it in a pinch for a tight situation. So those are the changes I'd like to see for Brewmaster Monk. We're going to move on now to Windwalker Monk. The Windwalker Monk's current state. Windwalker Monk surprised many people with how effective it was during the opening stages of Shadowlands. It quickly became the monk of choice for Mystic Touch and Raid after Complexity Limit's Trill showed off just how powerful the spec was during that World First level progression. It found in place in Raid for first time really since the Antorus Raid in Legion, and it has become a staple in Mythic Plus teams in MDI and in higher key compositions. There were a few nerfs, with bug fixes as well, that hurt its AoE damage capability, and its single target damage is already showing a little signs of struggle, so who knows what the future holds for this spec. So what is the change outside of the scope of a patch? Delete Storm, Earth, and Fire, make Serenity the baseline cooldown with some tweaks to make it a DPS gain to use, and baseline Whirling Dragon Punch. This essentially erases the entire level 50 talent row and forces Blizzard to make a new row of talents in its place. I think this makes it obvious why this is probably outside the scope of a patch and more for a alpha for a new expansion, but I think it fixes multiple issues. It gets rid of the buggiest button in the game in Storm, Earth, and Fire, makes Serenity a much better ability to use and a much more simple ability to use for new players, and it gives Windwalkers another baseline ability to continue rolling their mastery with. Whirling Dragon Punch has been picked in almost all situations outside of Arena for pretty much the last 5 years. And I think it's time to baseline the ability when it's been the only pick in its row in all but very, very specific content, which is Arena World Championships, for 99% of the time. I've never seen Spiritual Focus get used, and Serenity is actually a DPS lost to use in PvE content, so I'd like to see some tweaks made to that row. But hopefully maybe in patch 10.0. So what are the changes inside the scope of the patch that we could make? Well, I have 2 suggestions. Number 1, make an addition to Rising Sun Kick that gives it a chance equal to your crit value to hit a second time. If you're worried about burst, this second time can't crit. This gives Windwalker single target burst in PvE, and while I can already hear the PvP cries, Windwalker is a glass cannon spec in PvP right now, so Mastery and Verse are going to be much more priority stats. This also gives Windwalker a PvE scaling stat for the first time in quite a number of years. It allows our single target damage to improve without breaking any AoE mechanics. And to avoid any new ridiculous bugs with Storm, Earth, and Fire, this can only proc off the Monk's Rising Sun Kick and not the clones that you summon with Storm, Earth, and Fire. We know that any change to Storm, Earth, and Fire causes 10,000 new bugs with the ability anyways, so let's just try to save ourselves some headache. The second change is Legendaries. Legendaries feel very bland for Windwalker Monk at this time. A buff to Juan's Battle Gear or Jade Ignition to be competitive with Invoker's Delight would add some flavor to the Windwalker Legendary choice. Right now, Windwalker is the only spec with a very minimal variety in its legendaries. You basically use Invoker's Delight in all situations. I'd like to see a Windwalker specific legendary compete with the general Monk legendary, and I think Invokers and Juan's Battle Gear and Jade Ignition are the perfect candidates for little buffs to be made to make them more competitive in single target and AoE situations. Juan's Battle Gear got a buff in patch 9.0.5, but it was much more PvP oriented, and I think that there needs to be more done to make the ability or the legendary feel good in PvE. Maybe a Fist of Fury buff would help. But that's the thoughts that I have on Windwalker Monk. Let's move on and we'll finish up with Mistweaver Monk. The Mistweaver Monk current state. Mistweaver Monk is struggling to garner respect and a place in the healing role of World of Warcraft. While the healing output itself is good enough for most content, it has an issue of not having a clear vision for what the spec should be. Both the caster-based and fist-weaving style builds have talents that contradict each other, even within the own builds themselves, and there's very little support in the legendary, soulbind, and conduit systems for the fist-weaving style of play. The other thing is that Mistweaver Monk is a Mystic Touch applicator, and they have no range damage dealing spells. Thus, they're incentivized to be in melee range. They do the lowest damage of any healer though. It fails in comparison to Holy Paladin, the other melee-based healer, in every metric of healing, damage dealing, and utility. Why bring a Mistweaver Monk when you can just get a Holy Paladin and do everything better? That's the place that Mistweaver Monk is in right now. So what are the changes outside the scope of a patch that I think could be done? Well, rework the spec. The spec doesn't have a clear focus and hasn't had one for quite some time. The talent tree has some good rows in it, but it doesn't help focus the spec in a direction. It either focuses on support for the caster-based build or some small fist-weaving support talents, but doesn't really do anything to enhance the single target healing or AoE healing. There's not a choice of single target AoE talents, it's fist-weaving or caster-style build. Now you can say the base kit of Mistweaver Monk has a lot of single target and AoE support built into it, but for newer players it's not necessarily always clear to the spec how it all works and functions and intertwines. So maybe pushing in some of that functionality into some talents with a baseline focus and maybe the fist weaving style, I think would be a really good way to help focus the spec a little bit. The spec feels like a mess of borrowed power thrown on top of the basic functions of spells, and the spec kind of has ADHD almost, where it's just kind of bouncing around trying to do a bunch of different things and not really being able to focus and narrow itself into one niche. But again, reworking an entire spec, that really hasn't happened since 7.2.5 rather, with Legion. So it's been a number of years since they've done a mid-expansion rework of any specs. I don't expect that we'll see that with Shadowlands because Blizzard is working from home, and I think that makes it a lot harder for them to have the bandwidth and the developer bandwidth to be able to do things like rework the spec or do a bunch of the things that are kind of outside the scope of a simple patch. But there are a couple of changes that can be made within the scope of a patch that I think would be very useful. Number one, buff the damage Mistweaver Monk does. If Blizzard is going to incentivize Mistweaver Monks to be in melee to deal damage and apply Mystic Touch, then make those damage buttons feel good to press and make monks feel incentivized to do damage when it's necessary. Right now, really only Rising Sun Kick feels good to press, and that's more because of just Rising Sun Kick is a very strong baseline ability. But everything else feels just like you're filling a gap until Rising Sun Kick comes back off of cooldown. Whereas with Holy Paladin, Crusader Strike, Holy Shock, Consecration, even Shield of the Righteous, they all feel impactful to push it, damage dealing wise. Whereas Tiger Palm, Blackout Kick, Spinning Crane Kick, these abilities just feel like you're filling time waiting for someone to take damage or for Rising Sun Kick to come back off of cooldown. I think these numbers need to be goosed a lot to make Mistweaver have a very clear niche, maybe pushing it into a fist-weaving baseline spec. The second change that I like to see is giving fist-weaving some support through the borrowed power systems. While it has one legendary in Ancient Teachings of the Monastery, there's no soulbind ability or conduit support that helps fist-weaving build feel even stronger. There's nothing there like a potency conduit that can help lean into making fist-weaving feel even more powerful, more clearly defined as a play style. And I think it would go a long way in making that style of play feel better to play, along with making it a much more clearly defined style for new and experienced players to really lean into. So those are my thoughts on the Mistweaver Monk. Before we get into the overall wrap-up, I want to talk about something else that I'd like to see. I wanted to address Monk utility. Monk utility is universal across all three specs. Brewmaster, Windwalker, and Mistweaver all bring Mystic Touch, Tiger's Lust, Ring of Peace. There's not really anything that separates a Mistweaver Monk from a Windwalker Monk from a Brewmaster Monk. Once you have one Monk, you have literally all the utility that they bring. The only reason to bring a second Monk is because either A, that's who you have on your raid roster and that's who's available, or B, maybe the spec is tweaked and tuned to be very good. You can see that with maybe Brewmaster and Windwalker Monks kind of playing in that role right now, but even then you're only still seeing mostly in all raids that want to carry a Monk, only one of them. So I think something that allows each spec to have a small little niche that is still somewhat unique to the spec while also kind of still feeling like a Monk ability itself, I think that can help some feeling of blandness between the specs. Yes, tanking, DPS, and healing playstyles are very different, but once you get those down, everything else that you do is the same as what you do for your other two specs. And I don't think that's all that appealing. You get some differences with certain other specs. You can look at, Warlocks has their different playstyle, but they get a bunch of utility. If you look at something like Druid, they have a lot of different utility that you can do based on your spec. If you're a Feral Druid, you can throw off heals with Predatory Swiftness. You can taunt and tank. You can even go into Boomkim form with Balance Affinity and do a little bit of damage at range if you're forced off the boss for a certain period of time. Monk doesn't have anything like that allows them to feel like this is a thing that Mistweaver Monks do that's really cool. There are definitely other things that you could definitely do overall with some abilities. I think Revival for the Mistweaver spec needs to be overhauled, but that's a different video, I think, for a different time. It might be something I revisit a little bit later. So what's the overall situation for Monk? I think Monk is in a decent place overall, but definitely some high points and absolutely some low points. I think Brewmaster is in the best current health in terms of current standing, and I think it has the most rosy outlook moving into the future of the expansion. Windwalker's in the best spot it's been in for years, but the lingering concerns around its single target damage and the buggy Storm, Earth, and Fire ability, if they could address those out, and then also fix the bugs, I think the Windwalker's probably going to overtake Brewmaster as the best Monk spec for this expansion. Mistweaver, however, is in the roughest position, and it feels like the most neglected spec of Monk, and one of the most neglected healing specs in World of Warcraft. I think it needs some serious development time from a developer that truly understands what the spec can do and what it's capable of to make it feel like it's a useful contributor to your raids or to your Mythic Plus teams. Because right now, they just kind of fill a spot, but they don't do anything else. And that doesn't feel good as someone that wants to play Mistweaver, but really struggles to get into the spec because I don't feel like I do all that much. Whereas on a Resto Druid, I have a lot of different things that I've been doing in terms of my experience playing that healer. I can roll up everyone with hots, drop into Boomkin form, convoke, do some damage. I can Typhoon, I can Ursol's Vortex to control mobs, I can Cyclone a mob. There's just a lot that I can do on my Resto Druid. With Mistweaver Monk, I go in, I spinning Crane Kick to apply Mystic Touch, and I kind of just somewhat do damage, somewhat heal, with occasionally having to drop big bomb heals in high damage situations like a Prideful buff. But outside of that, you don't really do anything else. You just kind of do a little bit of damage, do a little bit of healing. You don't have any other ways to make the class feel really powerful. And that goes really for all three specs of Monk. Anyways, guys, how do you feel about the state of Monk in the current patch 9.0.5 and for what we know about patch 9.1 on the horizon? Comment below and let's talk about my favorite class in WoW. I'd love to hear from you. So, I don't really have much going on in the ways of next few videos. I've got a couple planned out. I'm going to work on the Paladin, Soulbind Conduits, and Covenant videos, and I'm also starting work on my Druid Beginner's Guide. I'll be putting up a few dungeon runs in the meantime, both of my Brewmaster Monk, as I'm getting very close to getting 15s done, but also on my Resto Druid, because I think it'd be interesting for you guys to see kind of how I handle both a tanking role and a healing role with two very different classes. So I hope to see you all, you amazing, wonderful legends, at my next video. Until then, everyone, please stay safe. Please go get vaccinated, and I will see you all next time, as I will just let this video play out with music so you can see the rest of this dungeon run. Good night, guys.